Welcome to the premiere episode of the True Progress podcast, presented by Perfectus Magazine. If you're unfamiliar with Perfectus, we're an online magazine dedicated to featuring thoughtful writing, engaging interviews, and unique artwork focused on the intersection of academic literature, public policy, civilizational progress, and human flourishing. In this three-part series, we delve into one of the most literally dividing issues facing Americans and the world today: polarization. Undoubtedly, it's something you've heard of and possibly even felt. It's all around you and affects your relationships, your interactions, your daily life, from home to work and back. But what is polarization exactly? And is it really as bad and pervasive as you may think it is? And most importantly, what can we do about it? In Episode 1, we set the scene and define what polarization is. Then in Episode 2, we explore its effects on society. And finally, in Episode 3, we look for solutions and paths forward. Let's dive in. Episode 1. Defining division. It's become an all too familiar experience. Jim, a fictitious father of two, gets up in the morning and, over his coffee and perusal of the day's news on his iPad, unwittingly feels his anger and frustration rise over some political story. "These idiots don't know what they're doing," he exclaims to his wife Pam, also fictitious, as she gets their fictitious kids ready for school. Later, on his drive to work in ridiculous traffic, Jim is stuck behind a car with a slew of bumper stickers that revive the earlier anger at the kitchen table. "Moron," he mutters to himself as he reaches to turn up the volume on the car stereo to better hear his favorite talk radio host. When he arrives at work, Jim has a bit of pep in his step, because today he's ready with some facts and figures to counter Toby, the HR guy, who's always spouting off on the vaccine that he knows nothing about. And Jim's not alone. He and his coworker Daryl often commiserate about Toby on their breaks, but they have to be surreptitious about their conversations because far too many of their fellow employees seem to be on Toby's side, and more often than not, tempers have flared, and now, lines drawn and allegiances made. After work on his way home, Jim stops off at the store to pick up some groceries. He's judicious about which brands he buys because he doesn't want to support companies that have attacked his beliefs in their marketing. No way they're getting his dollars. While in the checkout line, the political slogan on the back of the t-shirt of the woman in front of him makes Jim shake his head and roll his eyes. Does she even understand what she's proudly saying to the world with that stupid shirt? He thinks to himself, almost on the verge of tapping her on the shoulder and giving her a piece of his mind. Finally, at the end of the day in bed, Jim knows he shouldn't check any of his social media accounts, even Instagram, which was originally supposed to be all about photography, but he can't resist. "I just want to get a quick peek at what's happening," he tells himself, kind of convincingly. And sure enough, after spending far too long on his iPad, Jim finally, angrily turns it off, way too worked up now to actually fall asleep. Despite this being a fictional narrative, chances are good that it resonates with many of you. And if we're being truthful, Jim could be someone from the left, the right, or the middle. So were we always so intolerant of ideas we don't agree with and ready to pounce at each other's throats? Or are things truly different today? Jim's struggles with bad traffic, annoying work colleagues, and divisive politics aren't new to civilization. We've been struggling with those for as long as any of us can remember. But social media is still a new, evolving phenomenon. The reach of global politics certainly seems like it has extended into every nook and cranny of life. And overall trust in institutions is at an all-time low. Is this all what's referred to as polarization? Tony Woodlief is the Senior Executive Vice President with State Policy Network and author of iCitizen, a blueprint for reclaiming American self-governance.
There's a lot of news stories about polarization. It's sort of a commonplace belief now that in America we're a very polarized society. So we talk about it a lot in the U.S. right now when we say, oh, our country's more polarized than ever. But when people say that, what they mean is that, oh, golly, used to have a lot of people sort of in the middle, maybe center left, center right, sort of moderate, or maybe I don't even know. And now they're all moving to the extremes and they hate each other. And so when you think polarization, you think poles and you think that spectrum of belief or ideology. And polarization refers to this phenomenon where people apparently drift towards the ends of the spectrum, whatever it may be.
Dan Vallone is the U.S. Director for the nonprofit research organization More in Common.
The question of how do we define polarization is both really important and on one hand, easy to answer, and yet I think disguised as actually a very complex reality. So in the simplest way, polarization could be described as the extent to which groups or people diverge along some sort of axis in how they respond to or think about particular stimuli, public policy issues, right? So we could be polarized in terms of our attitudes about whether we should pursue more government-centric public policy reforms or free market-centric policy reforms. And you could be polarized along many different axes, or you could be less polarized, et cetera. But I think it obscures the more complex reality, which is the way that we use polarization in the more colloquial sense is really about the degree to which we feel tribal identities that are in opposition to one another, right? And so it's not just about any single issue or area that we may disagree about. Polarization in the way that it is used in media and in politics really speaks to the ways in which we are separating in the identities that we associate and attach importance to as individuals and groups.
Tribalism is certainly a familiar idea we've all likely encountered before. In broad terms, it means the behavior and attitudes that stem from strong loyalty to one's own tribe or social group. And it's the precursor, the initial spark to polarization. Tony Woodlief.
You do see a sort of tribal or communal sorts of allegiances to political tenets that are born not from like reflection or firm commitment, but from a loyalty to the group. When I was in college, I was a liberal for a good part of it, and then a libertarian. And of course, I held all the views of my friends because they're my friends, and I want to be part of them. But I hadn't really formed a set of opinions that was durable. You see a sort of idea contagion among all people, but especially young people.
This is a very important point. People often form allegiances towards ideas that belong to a group, an identity, rather than from a principled position of upholding tested, durable ideas. And yes, tribalism isn't something unique to the youth, something that we simply grow out of. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that we have a biological history of overarching tribal behavior ingrained in our DNA. Clay Routledge is the Vice President of Research and Director of the Human Flourishing Lab at the Archbridge Institute.
As human beings, we're biologically programmed to see ourselves in terms of groups and to divide people along group lines. When you think about people as individuals, as psychologists tend to do, it's easy to think about, we have different motivations, we have different goals in our lives, different priorities, different personalities. But one of the things that social psychologists discovered really starting in the early 1970s is that people don't just tend to think of themselves as individuals, they actually tend to think of themselves as part of a group, what's also known as a group identity. And oftentimes we can think of these identities as being like deeply important to us. They can be our religious identities, our national identities, professional identities, and things like that. But what these researchers discovered was that we're so wired up for group identity as humans that even the most trivial group distinctions will lead us to be biased. And so, for instance, in the earliest experiment they did, they brought kids into a lab and they put a bunch of dots randomly on the screen. So you just see these dots, and then you're asked by the scientists to estimate how many dots are there on the screen. Just take a quick look and estimate the number of dots. The scientists weren't at all interested in how accurate these estimations were. What they were is creating a situation in which they could subsequently divide these kids into groups and to say, hey, you actually underestimated the number of dots, or you overestimated the number of dots. So really, it was just a way to create this very, very simple and basic group distinction that had no real meaning beyond that. That simple distinction, you're in the underestimated group or the overestimated group, led these boys to have biased attitudes and to engage in biased decision-making. So for example, they had them do these games where they had to allocate tokens or points that translated to money to other boys in the experiment. And what they found was, knowing nothing else about these boys, they tended to give more tokens, more money to their fellow underestimators or to their fellow overestimators. So this was like the basic idea of what's called the minimal group. So you don't have to have a shared history. You don't have to have some deep bond that connects you. It's just in our brains to be biased in favor of those who share some kind of group identity with us. Obviously, most of the time, we're not talking about minimal groups. We're talking about really, really important groups. But that helps us understand, like at some basic psychological level, we just tend to group things. We tend to group animals, we tend to group objects, we tend to group all sorts of things in life, including ourselves. And so once we start grouping ourselves, that's when you can start going down the road to in-group favoritism, to bias, to prejudice, and to social conflict. And you start mixing in other things that are actually really important, like deep beliefs, competition over scarce resources. Then you can imagine how what starts out as like a simple, like basic favoritism towards people like you can turn into something far more dramatic. A really good example that most people will understand of kind of everyday group identity is sports affiliation. You know, many people who are sports followers have their favorite teams, and they tend to have some identity connected to those teams. And so even though you might not know, somebody that you see, at a bar or at a sporting event as an individual, if they're wearing the logo of your favorite team, wearing the t-shirt, supporting your favorite team, you feel some connection to them. And so that forms the basis of a group. In fact, there have certainly been stories of riots happening at sporting events or fights breaking out because people care about their favorite sports team so much, they become so passionate about their sports team and so antagonistic towards rival sports teams. And so we can think about sports as oftentimes kind of a silly example, but sometimes can be really consequential. But then you can start to think about group identities that actually have, more serious implications for our daily lives, such as politics.
So, sports and politics, two of the least divisive topics at the water cooler. In fact, our fictional friend Jim remembers a time when conversations at work were actually about sports. They revolved around the latest draft picks, fantasy sports leagues, the game last night, or the championships fast approaching and all the social obligations of planning a party that tagged along. And sure, tempers sometimes rose over who's the best player or who's the worst coach. But although we take our sports really, really personally, at the end of the day, it's more fun and games than anything else. That is, until politics invaded sports, along with everything else. And with politics, it's not simply light banter. People go for the jugular, because it's the opposite of sports. It's life and death and making a living and putting food on the table and paying your bills and war and peace and everything in between. So when you add tribalistic behavior and group identities to a hyper-connected and hyper-aware socio-political context where so much is on the line, is there any chance that we end up with a friendly conversation? A may the best team win, like a wager over the Super Bowl used to be? Ilana Redstone is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and the faculty director of the Mill Institute at the University of Austin in Texas.
Where I've sort of landed on this is that this problem is largely one of sort of the harsh judgment of people's characters and demonization. I don't mean to say it's the only thing going on, but judgment, or I'll use the clearer term of demonization, always comes from certainty. And I don't like the word always, but it, as far as I can tell, it always comes from certainty in the sense that when we demonize someone, and I'm talking particularly about on these issues, it's always coming from some belief, value, or principle that we're holding as inviolable. And so part of the problem is that we're not very good at sort of making that thinking explicit and being clear about what those principles, values, and beliefs are. It always comes from something that we're holding as inviolable. That certainty is what justifies the judgment in the first place. It is at the root of the problem. It is a way of thinking. We have lost the ability to sort of interrogate. We're okay at sort of interrogating other people's thinking, sort of, right? Because it's about the takedown and it's about power and sort of demonstrating how intelligent you are. And it has all these other things wrapped up in it. We're not as good at interrogating our own thinking and slowing down our thinking and making the implicit explicit. When we're treating our beliefs, values, and principles as certain, we're denying ourselves and others the opportunity to question it. So to circle back and to sort of close the loop on the political polarization, that creates resentment. It creates contempt, all of these things. It can push people towards extremes. It doesn't foster trust.
Dan Vallone provides some more context.
Conventionally, for I think hundreds of years, we've often described politics through a left-right spectrum, where if you are on the left, you favor a more activist government, and if you're on the right, you favor a more free market orientation or private sector response. Well, to what extent do we disagree about how we should approach immigration reform? To what extent do we disagree on how we should approach the best solutions for healthcare, et cetera? That's increasingly less descriptive of at least the American context. There's still societies in the world today that probably are better understood through that kind of issue-centric polarization. In the US, polarization is much more identity-based. And the simplest way to maybe think about that is it's less about what you believe in a public policy standpoint and more about who you associate with and who you feel like is either given preferential or discriminatory treatment in today's society. And so that question of who becomes much more important when we consider polarization in the identity context.
Indeed, as we discussed earlier, identity versus ideas. So what happens when, as a society, we are actually experiencing much more tangible daily interactions, both personal and impersonal, that contain even deeper, more important cultural differences that really are more about identity? It could be someone you meet on a subway who's from a different part of the country, or it could be a place you go for lunch with owners and cuisine from a faraway land. Or it may be an ad in front of a YouTube video that represents people and ideas you aren't familiar with. Ben Klutsey is the director of the program on pluralism and civil exchange at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University.
We're becoming a more diverse society. Just recently reading Yascha Monk's book, The Great Experiment, and he's talking about the changes that we're seeing in democratic societies across the Western world. And he says that, look, some of the most celebrated societies or celebrated democracies have not been multi-ethnic. And some of the most celebrated multi-ethnic societies have not been democratic. And so for the very first time in our history, we're seeing not only in the United States, but across Europe as well, and other parts of the world, societies that are growing, increasing large multi-ethnic democracies. And I think that that level of diversity is important. I think it enriches our societies, but we also have to learn to navigate it well so that we can be a more flourishing society.
Ben, of course, is speaking about pluralism. As a broader concept, it's simply the coexistence of different ideas, groups, principles, ethnicities, cultures, etc., within a system or society. He continues.
And we focus on pluralism because pluralism helps us think through how we might coexist and live together amidst deep divides. John Inazu, who wrote the book Confident Pluralism, says pluralism has two important features. One is inclusion, the idea that we will constantly try to include more and more people who have been originally marginalized in a society as we become more morally enlightened. And I think that's important. You see that with the civil rights, you see that with women's suffrage, you see that with a lot of things that have taken place in the United States where we've tried to include more and more people and so that we can become a more perfect union, if you will. But at the same time, because we have free speech, because we have all these things that are ingrained and enshrined in our Constitution, we have to be able to accept dissent, and that dissent is the other important feature in pluralism, and that there are people who will dissent and disagree about current trends, current issues, prevailing orthodoxies, and they would want to form their own communities and groups and connect with others and form associations that are different from the orthodoxies or the way in which things are trending, and that's okay too. So in a robustly pluralistic society that is able to weather the storms of polarization as one that is able to kind of engage very well on this question of inclusion and dissent and trying to manage it over time. And so, he says we need toleration, we need humility, and we need patience. We need a lot of patience for one another and to tolerate each other with our differences and be humble enough to understand that sometimes we might be wrong, but ultimately we want to see each other succeed. We want to see a flourishing society.
Clay Routledge.
And also a recognition that we are a dynamic and diverse society and thinking about that as a strength. So we often hear the word pluralism when we talk about the United States, that we're a pluralistic country. And that can really help us when we have the temptation to want to tell other people, no, you shouldn't do that, or you shouldn't think that, is the idea that at some level our country is built on the notion of freedom. And that means tolerating people having opinions and ways to live that are different than the ones you choose. And as long as they're not messing with you, you shouldn't mess with them, obviously, we create rules and to protect children, for instance. But, some basic agreement that as much as possible, we want people to have liberty. And I think that there's a way to think about that that's non-political, that you could get people, whether they are Democrats or Republicans, to come together under some shared understanding that pluralism and liberty are part of that American narrative. And that also connects to the American dream.
All right, so hopefully we've come to a basic understanding of what polarization means within the context of our society. And more importantly, hopefully, we all agree that a pluralistic society in which different, even opposing ideas can coexist is what we want. But is there a way to measure the degree of polarization within our society? Dan Vallone, through the nonprofit research organization he works for, More in Common, has some answers for us.
So our first report in the U.S., which is probably still what we're best known for, was a report called Hidden Tribes, a study of America's polarized landscape. And here we categorize the American population into 7 distinct segments. And the way we did it was we fielded a very large survey. 8,000 Americans took the survey, and we used the survey responses to questions that were all about their underlying worldview and behaviors. So we didn't use demographic information. We didn't use their political identity to segment them. And we found that by looking through this lens of what we call core beliefs, so people's worldviews, we were able to generate a much more accurate, much more complex, much more nuanced picture of Americans than what you see if you just categorize people by Democrat, Republican, Independent, or by traditional demographics. And the finding that probably stood out the most from Hidden Tribes, and that is still really salient, is this idea of what we call the exhaustive majority, that the most intensely polarized segments of our population on both the left and the right are actually disproportionately small slices of the population, that most Americans actually still share things like the importance they attach to trying to compromise and generate real solutions, that most Americans don't prioritize their political identity as the most important identity to them. It's much more about family, about their values, about their local community. And that most Americans are very fed up and exhausted by the divisiveness in politics. And so this exhausted majority, I think, has had a lot of influence in terms of shaping how institutions across politics, media, and the private sector and civil society think about audiences. And it still is salient today.
That certainly sounds like good news, that most people aren't as polarized as we perceive. But of course, it's tempered with some not-so-great revelations that a small minority is really skewing that perception. Dan continues with more.
The second big report that I would highlight is something we released in 2019 called Perception Gap. And this was our first foray into trying to measure the extent to which Americans have accurate understandings of their political opposites. So we know that, for example, Democrats and Republicans have both become increasingly likely to describe the other party as not just wrong on policy, but as a threat and as hateful. The use of kind of moral attacks has grown increasingly common in the political space. And so we wanted to understand, has that worsening in how we feel towards our political opponents, has that occurred alongside of people having a really accurate sense of who their political opponents are and what they believe? And what we found is the answer is no. So we asked basically Democrats and Republicans to answer a set of questions about various policy issues, everything from gun control to attitudes towards Donald Trump and climate change, and the full spectrum of salient issues in politics. And then we asked Democrats, what percentage of Republicans do you think agree with the following statements? For example, immigration is a good thing for the country. And we asked Republicans the same question about Democrats. What percentage of Democrats do you think agree with the following statements? And those statements were things like, there's a right to bear arms, et cetera. And what we found was that Democrats and Republicans overall had very inaccurate views of what the average Democrat or Republican, what their average political opponent believed. And the perception gap, which is the difference between what I think my political opponent believes and what my political opponent actually believes, gets worse the more ideological a person is. So the most ideological segments of our population, those most actively involved in politics, have the weakest and least accurate understanding of their political opponents. And so this is important because it means that, again, we have genuine disagreements. We have important disagreements. These aren't trivial. but we are compounding those disagreements by holding distorted pictures of what our political opponents actually believe. And this impedes our ability to work across the aisle and engage on areas of common ground and to make progress on those important disagreements which we genuinely do hold. The question of, has polarization gotten worse? So More in Common, we did our first research in the US in 2018. So I'll use 2018 as kind of like the benchmark. I would make the case that certainly in the past 10, 15 years, identity-based polarization has worsened. We can show that partisans have grown more likely to describe their opponents as a threat, as to attribute to them characteristics such as hateful or brainwashed. That has gotten worse. Again, that's different from attitudes and views on like gun control or immigration reform or healthcare policy. Whether it's gotten worse in the past 4 years, I think it's not fully clear. It hasn't gotten much markedly better, is what I would say. So on a negative level, we have seen, I think, a hardening among the more ideologically charged segments of the population on both the left and the right. And so there are ways in which the most negative elements of identity-based polarization have probably gotten worse.
So although polarization is amplified and magnified by a small minority, and although most Americans aren't part of that, we still have grown apart. And that's not great news. And when our everyman Jim, or maybe you, feel frustrated during your daily routine, in simple interactions that shouldn't carry so much tension and potential for volatility, neither Jim nor you are imagining things. But the first step to figuring our way out of this is to realize the problem isn't just them, but all of us. Thank you for joining us for this first episode of True Progress Polarization, presented by Profectus Magazine. For more information, visit profectusmag.com and sign up for our newsletter to make sure you never miss an article. Please tune in next for our second episode where we explore the disastrous effects of polarization on our society and our institutions.